The impact threw Kyle Morrison across the corridor as the hull breach siren screamed through the station. He hit the wall hard, his vision blurring as emergency lights painted everything in crimson. Through the chaos, he saw her, the alien diplomat from the Valerian delegation, trapped beneath a fallen support beam. Purple blood seeped from a gash across her shoulder, her silver eyes wide with terror as the atmospheric seal began to fail. Kyle's training kicked in before his brain could process the danger. The nearest emergency bulkhead was already descending, 20 seconds until it sealed this section off completely. Anyone left inside would suffocate when the oxygen vented into space. He scrambled to his feet, ignoring the sharp pain in his ribs, and sprinted toward her. She tried to speak, but the thinning air stole her words. Kyle grabbed the beam with both hands and pulled. It didn't budge. 15 seconds. His muscles screamed as he repositioned himself, planted his feet, and lifted with everything he had. The beam shifted slightly. The alien woman, whose name he remembered was Lyra, tried to pull herself free but couldn't quite manage it. 10 seconds. The bulkhead was halfway down now, a massive steel barrier that would crush anything in its path. Kyle adjusted his grip one more time, channeling every ounce of strength into his legs and back. The beam rose 6 inches. Lyra dragged herself forward, wincing with each movement. 5 seconds. Kyle's vision started to tunnel from the lack of oxygen. He saw Lyra clear the beam and knew he'd made it. Then his legs buckled. He tried to move toward the bulkhead, but his body wouldn't respond. The world tilted sideways as he collapsed. The last thing he remembered was Lyra's face hovering over his, her hand pressed against his chest, and a warmth spreading through him that felt like sunlight on summer skin. Then everything went black. Kyle woke 3 days later in the medical bay. The doctors told him he'd been clinically dead for 4 minutes. The bulkhead had sealed, the breach had been contained, and somehow both he and Lyra had ended up on the safe side of it. Nobody could explain how. The security footage showed them on the wrong side when the door closed, then showed them on the safe side 30 seconds later with no record of movement between. But that wasn't the strangest part. Kyle sat up in bed and looked at his hands. The chronic arthritis that had plagued him since his 20s was gone. The scar from a training accident he'd had at 17 had vanished. When the doctors ran their tests, they found his cellular degradation had reversed by approximately 15 years. His bones were denser. His reflexes were sharper. His eyesight, which had required corrective lenses since childhood, was now perfect. Lyra visited him on the 4th day. She moved carefully, still recovering from her injuries, but there was something different about how she looked at him, something that made him deeply uncomfortable because it resembled reverence. She sat beside his bed and spoke softly in accented English. Her people, the Valerians, possessed certain abilities that humans didn't understand yet. When someone saved a Valerian's life at the cost of their own, ancient biological imperatives kicked in. She had bonded with him at a cellular level during those final seconds, sharing something her people called the essence transfer. It was supposed to be impossible between species, but desperation and gratitude had made it happen anyway. Kyle listened, trying to process what she was telling him. The warmth he'd felt hadn't been his imagination. She'd given him part of herself, rewriting portions of his DNA, extending his lifespan, enhancing his physical capabilities. The doctors estimated he might live another 200 years now, maybe more. His body would age slower than any human in history. But there was more, she said, her silver eyes never leaving his face. The bond went both ways. Part 2, Lyra explained that the essence transfer created a permanent connection between them, something her people experienced only with their bonded mates. She could feel his emotions now like distant echoes in her mind. When he was in pain, she would know. When he was in danger, she would sense it across any distance, and he would feel the same from her, though it might take time for his human neurology to adjust to the sensation. Kyle stared at her, his mind reeling. He'd saved her life on instinct, never expecting anything in return, certainly nothing like this. The thought of being mentally linked to someone, even partially, felt invasive despite the incredible physical gifts she'd given him. She must have sensed his discomfort because she stood quickly, her movements graceful despite her injuries. She told him she understood this wasn't what he wanted, that her people would arrange for her to leave the station as soon as she was cleared for travel. She would go somewhere far away where the bond wouldn't trouble him. Distance wouldn't break it, but it might make it easier to ignore. Something in her voice, a note of profound sadness, made Kyle reach out and catch her wrist before she could leave. He didn't know what he was going to say, but the words never came, because the moment his skin touched hers, he felt it, a rush of sensation that wasn't his own. Her grief at being torn from her homeworld by political necessity, her fear during the whole breach, her overwhelming gratitude toward him, and beneath it all, a bone-deep loneliness that mirrored something in his own heart. She gasped and pulled away, her silver eyes shimmering with unshed tears. She apologized and fled the medical bay before he could respond. The doctors released Kyle 2 days later with strict instructions to report any unusual symptoms. He returned to his quarters in the residential sector, a small apartment that suddenly felt emptier than it ever had before. He tried to resume his normal routine, working his shift in station security, eating in the cafeteria, exercising in the gym, but everything felt different now. Colors seemed more vivid, sounds had layers he'd never noticed, and there was a constant awareness at the edge of his thoughts, like someone standing just outside his peripheral vision. A week after waking up, Kyle was running diagnostics on the security grid when the sensation spiked. Fear, sharp and immediate, flooded through him. Not his fear, Lyra's. He abandoned his post and ran toward the diplomatic quarters, his enhanced body carrying him faster than should have been possible. But other security personnel shouted after him, but he didn't stop. He found Lyra's door sealed from the inside. He could hear raised voices, one of them hers. Kyle overrode the lock with his security codes and burst into the room to find 3 Valerian males surrounding her. They weren't touching her, not yet, but their body language was aggressive. One of them was speaking rapidly in the Valerian language, his tone harsh and demanding. Lyra saw Kyle, and relief washed through the bond so strongly it nearly staggered him. She spoke to the males in their language, and whatever she said made them turn to look at him. Their expressions shifted from anger to surprise to something that looked almost like fear. The largest of the 3 males addressed Kyle in broken English, demanding to know why a human had interfered in Valerian business. Kyle didn't answer. He moved to stand beside Lyra, his hand resting casually on the stunner at his belt. The message was clear enough. The 3 males exchanged glances. The largest one spoke again, this time to Lyra, his tone different now, less demanding, more cautious. Then they left, filing past Kyle with wide berths, their eyes never quite meeting his. When they were gone, Lyra sank into a chair and covered her face with her hands. Kyle wanted to ask what that was about, but he was still learning to interpret the emotions flowing through the bond. What he felt from her now was shame mixed with anger and a fierce protectiveness that seemed directed at him. She finally looked up and explained. Those males were from a rival political faction on her homeworld. They'd learned about the essence transfer and wanted her to return home immediately. Among her people, such a bond was sacred, but it was also a scandal when it crossed species lines. They feared what it might mean for Valerian society if others learned a human carried Valerian essence. Kyle processed this slowly. He asked if she was in danger. Lyra hesitated before admitting that she might be. The political situation on her homeworld was complicated. Some factions wanted closer ties with humanity. Others saw humans as inferior beings who should be kept at arm's length. Her bond with Kyle could be weaponized by either side. He made a decision then, one that surprised him even as the words left his mouth. He told her he would protect her. She'd given him an incredible gift, intentional or not, and he wasn't going to let anyone hurt her because of it. Lyra stared at him like he'd just sprouted wings. She reminded him that he barely knew her, that this wasn't his fight, that getting involved in Valerian politics could ruin his career or worse. Kyle shrugged and said that saving people was literally his job. Besides, he added with a slight smile, he could feel through the bond that she didn't actually want to leave the station. She laughed, a sound like crystal chimes, and admitted he was right. She'd fought hard to be assigned to the human station as part of the diplomatic exchange. Going back now would mean surrendering to the same restrictive society she tried to escape. Over the following weeks, Kyle became Lyra's unofficial guardian. He escorted her to diplomatic functions. He stood watch outside her quarters during station night cycles. He learned basic Valerian phrases and studied their customs. Other humans started to notice, whispering about the security officer who'd gone native. His supervisor called him in for a formal review, questioning whether his judgment had been compromised. Kyle maintained that he was simply doing his job protecting a diplomatic guest, but he knew it was more than that. The bond had deepened. He could sense Lyra's presence even when she was on the other side of the station. Her joy became his joy. Her pain became his pain. It should have felt suffocating, but instead it felt like he'd found something he hadn't known he was missing. Lyra confided in him one evening that she'd never expected to form a bond at all. Most Valerians went their entire lives without experiencing it. The essence transfer only happened under the most extreme circumstances, and cross-species bonding was so rare that many considered it purely theoretical. She'd given him part of her soul without meaning to, driven by instinct and gratitude, and now neither of them could undo it. Kyle asked if she regretted it. She looked at him for a long moment before answering. No, she said. She didn't regret it at all. Part 3. The assassination attempt came during a diplomatic reception in the station's Grand Hall. Kyle was standing near the entrance, watching the crowd of humans and aliens mingle over expensive wine and delicate hors d'oeuvres. Lyra was across the room speaking with the Earth Ambassador, her elegant form draped in traditional Valerian silks that shimmered like oil on water. He felt the danger before he saw it, a spike of warning through the bond, primal and urgent. His eyes snapped to a Valerian male approaching Lyra from behind, his hand moving toward the decorative sash at his waist. Kyle was already moving, his enhanced speed carrying him across the room in seconds. He tackled the would-be assassin just as the male's hand emerged from the sash holding a small crystalline device. They hit the floor hard. The device skittered across the polished surface, and people screamed as they scattered. Kyle pinned the Valerian down, but the male was stronger than he expected. They grappled, trading brutal strikes. Kyle took an elbow to the jaw that would have knocked out his old self but barely fazed him now. He returned with a punch that sent the Valerian's head cracking against the floor. Station security arrived within moments, pulling Kyle off the unconscious attacker. The crowd had formed a wide circle around them, faces shocked and frightened. Kyle's supervisor, a hard-faced woman named Martinez, grabbed his arm and demanded to know what happened. Lyra answered before he could, her voice shaking but clear. She identified the attacker as a member of the Purification Movement, an extremist faction that believed Valerians should never interact with other species. She explained that the device he'd been carrying was a neural disruptor, designed to shut down the higher brain functions of other Valerians. It would have left her a living vegetable. Martinez ordered the station locked down. No ships in or out until they figured out if there were other conspirators. Brigg, still unconscious. Kyle found himself in an interview room an hour later, giving his statement for the third time. Martinez sat across from him, her expression unreadable. She asked how he'd known the attacker was a threat before the weapon was even visible. Kyle hesitated. The truth sounded insane, but Lyra had already explained the bond to Station Command during her own interview, and apparently they'd verified it with Valerian medical records. He told Martinez about the warning he'd felt through the bond. She listened without interrupting, then leaned back in her chair and studied him. She said that his enhanced abilities and his connection to Lyra made him a security asset, but they also made him a potential liability. She needed to know where his loyalties lay. Kyle didn't hesitate. His loyalty was to the station and its inhabitants, all of them, human and alien alike. If that meant protecting a Valerian diplomat from her own people, so be it. Martinez seemed satisfied with that answer. She told him he was officially assigned as Lyra's personal security detail, effective immediately. It would come with a pay increase and new accommodations large enough for a protection assignment. She also warned him that he was now a target. Anyone who wanted to hurt Lyra would go through him first. Kyle accepted the assignment without question. When he left the interview room, Lyra was waiting in the corridor. She looked exhausted, her silver skin pale with stress. He asked if she was all right. She nodded, but he could feel the lie through the bond. She was terrified, not for herself but for him. They walked to his quarters in silence. Kyle packed his essential belongings while Lyra stood by the window, staring out at the stars beyond the station's hull. She finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. She said he should request a transfer off the station, go somewhere the Purification Movement couldn't find him. She'd already brought enough danger into his life. Kyle zipped up his bag and turned to face her. He told her that running wasn't an option. The bond meant they were in this together, whether either of them had planned it or not. Besides, he'd faced down death once to save her. He wasn't about to stop now. Lyra's eyes shimmered with emotion. She crossed the room and did something that surprised him. She reached up and pressed her palm flat against his chest, right over his heart, in what he'd learned was an intimate Valerian gesture of trust and affection. He could feel her gratitude and something deeper, something that made his own heart race. Their new quarters were in the diplomatic sector, a suite of rooms with reinforced doors and dedicated security monitoring. Kyle spent the first night checking every entrance, testing every lock, mapping out defensive positions. Lyra watched him work with a mixture of amusement and concern. When he finally stopped, she made him sit and taught him some of the mental exercises Valerians use to control their emotional broadcasts through bonds. It would help, she explained, if he could filter out the background noise of her daily feelings and focus only on the important signals. Otherwise, he'd spend every moment distracted by her emotions. The exercises were harder than they looked. Kyle had to visualize the bond as a stream of water and himself as a stone in that stream. The water would flow around him unless he chose to let it in. After an hour of frustrating failures, he managed it for nearly 30 seconds before losing concentration. Lyra praised his progress with genuine warmth. She said most humans wouldn't be able to perceive the bond at all, let alone manipulate it. His Valerian essence was integrating better than anyone had expected. They fell into a routine over the next few weeks. Kyle accompanied Lyra to every meeting, every function, every diplomatic engagement. He learned to read the subtle body language of Valerians, to recognize the signs of aggression or deception. He met members of the pro-human faction who treated him with cautious respect, and members of the isolationist faction who barely concealed their disgust. Through it all, he felt Lyra's presence in his mind like a constant companion, her determination to bridge the gap between their species, her frustration with the political games she had to play, her growing affection for him that she tried to hide but couldn't completely mask through the bond. Kyle didn't acknowledge that last part. He told himself it was just gratitude amplified by the bond's intimacy, but late at night, when he stood watch while she slept, he couldn't deny that he felt something similar. The breakthrough came during a negotiation session about technology sharing. Lyra was arguing passionately for giving humans access to advanced Valerian medical techniques when one of the isolationist delegates accused her of being compromised by her bond with a human. The delegate suggested that Lyra could no longer represent Valerian interests objectively. Kyle felt Lyra's anger flash hot through the bond, but she kept her composure. She stood and addressed the chamber in flawless diplomatic speech, pointing out that the delegate's own prejudice was the real compromise to objectivity. The bond had given her unique insight into human resilience and potential. Humans had saved her life when her own people had left her to die during the hull breach. The chamber fell silent. The isolationist delegate had no response to that. The vote on technology sharing passed with a narrow majority. Afterward, in the privacy of their quarters, Lyra allowed herself to shake with released tension. Kyle brought her water and sat beside her, and for the first time since the bonding, she leaned against him and let him feel the full weight of her exhaustion and her hope. She whispered that she thought they might actually succeed in bringing their peoples closer together. Kyle agreed, even though he knew the danger was far from over. The purification movement wouldn't stop with one failed attempt. There would be others, more carefully planned, more difficult to predict. But looking at Lyra's determined face, feeling her unshakable conviction through the bond, Kyle found himself believing that they had a chance. Not just to survive, but to prove that the bond between them represented something greater than either species had imagined. Part 4. The second attack came 3 months later, and it was nothing like the first. No dramatic confrontation, no weapon drawn in public. Instead, Kyle woke one morning feeling like his blood was on fire. Every nerve in his body screamed. He tried to move and couldn't. His vision swam with colors that shouldn't exist. Through the haze of agony, he felt Lyra's panic. She was shouting something, her hands on his face, but the words dissolved before reaching his brain. Then darkness took him. He woke in the medical bay again, but this time the doctors wore hazmat suits. Lyra stood behind a transparent barrier, her face pressed against the material, her eyes wild with fear. Kyle tried to ask what was happening, but his mouth wouldn't cooperate. The head doctor, a stern man named Peters, explained in a carefully controlled voice. Kyle had been poisoned with a Valerian biotoxin called Shadow Blood. It was designed to attack individuals who carried Valerian genetic material. Normally it would be harmless to humans, but Kyle's modified DNA made him vulnerable. The toxin was breaking down his cells from the inside out. Lyra was screaming now, her words a mix of English and Valerian. She was demanding they let her in, that she could help, that the bond might allow her to filter the poison out of his system. Peters refused, explaining that exposure to her might accelerate the toxin's effects. The bond was what made Kyle vulnerable in the first place. Kyle wanted to tell her it was all right, that she shouldn't risk herself, but he couldn't speak. He could only feel her anguish through the bond, a raw wound that hurt worse than the poison destroying his body. The hours that followed were a blur of experimental treatments and desperate measures. Peters tried everything in the medical database. Nothing worked. The toxin was too specifically tailored, too aggressive. Kyle's enhanced healing factor, the gift Lyra had given him, was actually making things worse. His cells regenerated only to be destroyed again in an endless cycle of death and rebirth. Through it all, Kyle maintained his connection to Lyra. He could feel her working frantically on the other side of the barrier, accessing Valerian medical databases, consulting with doctors on her homeworld via subspace transmission. She refused to sleep, refused to eat, refused to accept that he might die because of her. On the second day, Kyle felt his hold on consciousness slipping. The pain had become so constant that it no longer registered as pain, just as a fundamental wrongness in his existence. He thought about the life he'd lived before meeting Lyra. Simple, predictable, lonely. The few months he'd spent with her had been more vivid than all those years combined. He tried to send that thought to her through the bond, a final message of gratitude, but she rejected it. She flooded the bond with fierce denial, with absolute refusal to let him go. And then something changed. Kyle felt new warmth spreading through his chest, different from the burning of the poison. It was familiar, the same sensation he'd experienced during the hull breach. Lyra was doing something, forcing more of her essence through the bond despite the distance and barriers between them. Peters was shouting, alarms were blaring, but Kyle's focus narrowed to that warmth. It spread like liquid light through his veins, chasing the poison, consuming it. His cells stopped their cycle of destruction. The fire in his blood began to cool. When he opened his eyes again, truly opened them, Lyra had collapsed against the barrier. Her silver skin had taken on a grayish tint, her breathing shallow and labored. Kyle realized with horror that she'd nearly killed herself saving him, pushing so much of her essence through the bond that she'd depleted her own reserves. He demanded Peters let him out, let him go to her. The doctor refused until the scans confirmed the toxin was completely neutralized. The moment he got clearance, Kyle stumbled out of the containment unit and caught Lyra as she fell. She was barely conscious, her eyes unfocused. Kyle carried her to another medical bed and stayed with her as Peters worked to stabilize her condition. The doctor explained that she'd done something unprecedented, using the bond as a conduit to transmit not just essence but active cellular instructions. She'd essentially reprogrammed Kyle's DNA on the fly to reject the poison. The effort had nearly stopped her heart, but she'd succeeded. Kyle was alive, and the bond between them had deepened to a level that Peters said shouldn't be physiologically possible. They were more interconnected now than any bonded pair in Valerian history. Station security identified the poisoner 2 days later, a human maintenance worker who'd been bribed by a Valerian isolationist cell. The worker had contaminated Kyle's food with the toxin, not understanding what it was or what it would do. The worker confessed everything under interrogation, providing names and communication records. The revelation sent shockwaves through both the human and Valerian communities on the station. A joint task force was formed to root out other conspirators. 12 Valerians and 5 humans were arrested over the following week, all connected to extremist groups opposed to species integration. When Lyra finally woke, 3 days after saving Kyle's life, the first thing she did was reach for his hand. He was there, had never left her side except when forced to by medical procedures. Their fingers interlaced and the bond hummed between them, stronger than ever. She tried to apologize, her voice weak. Kyle stopped her. He told her that she'd saved his life twice now, that any debt between them had been paid in full, and then some. If anything, he owed her. Lyra shook her head weakly. She explained that among her people, when someone saved your bonded mate, it created an obligation that transcended normal debts. But they weren't bonded mates, Kyle pointed out. They'd never chosen this. Lyra was quiet for a long moment. Then she said that maybe it was time they did choose it. Consciously, deliberately, instead of letting circumstance define their relationship. Kyle's heart rate spiked, and he knew she could feel it through the bond. He asked her what she meant. Lyra explained the Valerians had a formal bonding ceremony, a way to acknowledge and strengthen a connection that already existed. It would make their bond official in the eyes of both their peoples. It would also grant Kyle certain legal protections under Valerian law that might help shield him from future attacks. But more than that, she admitted, she wanted it. She'd fallen in love with him somewhere between the hull breach and the hospital bed. She knew it was complicated, that their peoples had centuries of cultural differences to overcome, that there would be opposition and danger. But she wanted to try. Kyle looked at her, really looked at her, silver skin that caught the light like moonlight on water. Eyes that held depths of emotion his old self never could have perceived, a mind he could touch across any distance. She'd given him a new life, literally and figuratively. And somewhere along the way, he'd fallen in love with her too. He said yes. The news of their impending bonding ceremony spread through the station like wildfire. Human reaction was mixed. Some celebrated it as a symbol of interspecies cooperation. Others condemned it as unnatural. The Valerian response was even more polarized. The pro-integration faction hailed it as a historic moment. The isolationists called it a betrayal of everything Valerian. Martinez pulled Kyle aside and warned him that this would make him a permanent target. Political statements always did. But she also told him she respected his choice, and that station security would do everything possible to protect both him and Lyra. Kyle thanked her and returned to Lyra's side. They had 2 weeks to prepare for the ceremony, 2 weeks during which the tension on the station ratcheted up to dangerous levels. Part 5. The ceremony was scheduled to take place in the station's central garden, a massive biodome that housed plants from a dozen different worlds. Lyra explained that Valerian bonding ceremonies traditionally occurred in places of natural growth, symbolizing the flourishing of the bond between two souls. Kyle spent those 2 weeks learning Valerian customs and phrases, studying the ritual steps until he could perform them in his sleep. Lyra did the same with human marriage traditions, wanting to incorporate elements of both cultures into their ceremony. They designed something unique, a fusion that honored both their heritages. Security concerns dominated the planning. Martinez assigned a full tactical team to guard the biodome during the ceremony. Every guest was screened multiple times. The station went to elevated alert status. Despite all the precautions, Kyle couldn't shake the feeling that something would go wrong. The night before the ceremony, he stood in the garden alone, testing his connection to the bond. Lyra was in her quarters, being prepared by Valerian attendants, going through purification rituals that tradition demanded. Kyle could feel her presence like a distant star, steady and bright. He sensed someone approaching before he heard footsteps. His hand moved to his weapon before he recognized the figure emerging from the shadows. Ambassador Chen, the Earth's senior diplomatic representative on the station. The elderly woman had always been kind to him, supportive of his relationship with Lyra. She joined him at the railing overlooking a grove of earth willows. She said that what he and Lyra were doing was brave, perhaps the bravest thing she'd witnessed in 40 years of diplomatic service. They were proving that the barriers between species weren't as insurmountable as some believed. Kyle thanked her, but Chen wasn't finished. She warned him that the ceremony was likely a trap. Intelligence had intercepted communications suggesting a major attack was being planned. Security was doing everything possible to prevent it, but Chen wanted Kyle to be prepared. She asked if he wanted to postpone. Kyle considered it for about 3 seconds before declining. Postponing would only give their enemies more time to plan. Better to face whatever was coming head-on, with all their defensive preparations in place. Chen nodded as if she'd expected that answer. She told him she'd arrange for emergency evacuation protocols just in case. Then she wished him luck and disappeared back into the shadows. Kyle returned to his quarters and tried to sleep, but the bond kept him awake. He could feel Lyra's nervousness, her excitement, her love. It wrapped around him like a blanket, comforting and terrifying in equal measure. The ceremony began at station noon, when the biodome's artificial sun was at its zenith. Guests filled the tiered seating, humans and Valerians sitting in segregated groups with a handful of brave individuals mixed between. Kyle stood at the center of the garden wearing a formal uniform that combined elements of human and Valerian dress. Music began. Something hauntingly beautiful played on instruments from both worlds. Lyra appeared at the garden's entrance, and Kyle's breath caught. She wore traditional bonding silks that flowed around her like liquid silver, her hair adorned with crystals that caught the light. She was the most beautiful thing he'd ever seen. She walked toward him, their eyes locked, the bond between them singing with joy. The officiant, a Valerian elder who'd agreed to conduct the ceremony, began speaking in both languages, describing the sacred nature of the bond and the courage required to forge new connections across the void between species. Kyle and Lyra spoke their vows, words they'd written together over long nights of conversation and compromise. They promised to honor each other, to protect each other, to build a bridge between their peoples through the strength of their connection. Kyle placed a ring on Lyra's finger, a human tradition. Lyra marked Kyle's forehead with silver ceremonial paint, a Valerian custom. The officiant was about to pronounce them bonded when Kyle felt it. A spike of malice through the crowd, focused and deadly. His enhanced reflexes saved them. He grabbed Lyra and dove sideways just as an energy pulse scorched the air where they'd been standing. Chaos erupted. Security moved in, weapons drawn. Kyle covered Lyra with his body as more shots rang out. Not just one attacker, but several positioned throughout the crowd. They could hear Martinez shouting orders, hear people screaming as they fled for the exits. Kyle pulled Lyra behind a decorative stone formation and assessed the situation. At least 4 attackers, maybe more, armed with Valerian energy weapons. They weren't trying to escape, which meant this was a suicide mission. They intended to kill Kyle and Lyra no matter the cost. Lyra was trembling against him, not with fear but with rage. He could feel it through the bond, a white-hot fury at having their ceremony violated. She wanted to fight back, but Kyle kept her pinned. She was a diplomat, not a soldier. This was his job. He spotted one of the attackers trying to flank their position. Kyle's enhanced speed gave him the advantage. He burst from cover, closed the distance in seconds, and disarmed the Valerian with a brutal efficiency that would have been impossible before his transformation. The attacker went down hard. Kyle took the Valerian's weapon and returned to Lyra. Security was engaging the other attackers now, tactical teams moving with practiced precision. But one assailant had broken through, rushing toward their position with a thermal charge that would incinerate everything within 10 meters. Kyle didn't think. He stepped out from cover and fired. The energy pulse caught the attacker's center mass, but not before the Valerian triggered the charge. Kyle grabbed Lyra and ran, his enhanced body carrying them both faster than should have been possible. The explosion threw them into a wall of vegetation, heat washing over them in a wave. When the smoke cleared, Kyle found himself lying on top of Lyra, both of them singed but alive. Security had neutralized all the attackers. The garden was destroyed, plants burning, decorative structures collapsed, but the guests were safe, having evacuated in the initial chaos. Martinez reached them, her face grim. She reported 7 attackers total, all members of the Purification Movement, all dead now. They'd smuggled weapons in piece by piece over the past week, assembling them inside the biodome. It had been sophisticated, well-planned, and they'd nearly succeeded. Kyle helped Lyra to her feet. Her ceremonial silks were torn and scorched. The silver paint on his forehead was smeared with soot. But they were alive, and they were together. He asked if the ceremony still counted since they'd been interrupted before the final pronouncement. The Valerian officiant, who'd survived by throwing himself behind a planter, emerged from his hiding spot. He looked at Kyle and Lyra, at the destruction around them, at the bond that blazed between them so strongly that even non-bonded Valerians could sense it. He declared that any bond strong enough to survive that level of violence needed no official pronouncement. In the eyes of the universe, they were already bonded. Lyra laughed, a sound of pure relief, and kissed Kyle for the first time. The bond erupted with shared emotion so powerful that Kyle's knees nearly buckled. He kissed her back, tasting smoke and sweetness and the promise of a future they'd fought so hard to reach. The aftermath took weeks to sort out. The attack had been planned by a coalition of extremist groups, both human and Valerian, united in their opposition to integration. But the attempted assassination had an unexpected effect. Moderate voices from both species came together, condemning the violence and calling for stronger cooperation. The Valerian government formally apologized and recalled their most vocal isolationist representatives. Earth's diplomatic corps sent reinforcements and resources to the station. The technology-sharing agreement that Lyra had been negotiating passed with an overwhelming majority. Kyle and Lyra moved into new quarters, specially designed with both species' needs in mind. Kyle continued working station security, but now with official status as Lyra's bonded mate, which gave him diplomatic immunity and a seat at certain political discussions. He used that access to push for better security cooperation between species, sharing the lessons learned from the attacks. Lyra's diplomatic work flourished. With Kyle at her side, she became a powerful voice for integration. Proof that the bond between species could be as strong as any bond within a species. She gave speeches, wrote papers, appeared in media across human and Valerian space. The bond between them continued to deepen. Kyle learned to send complex thoughts and images through the connection. Lyra adapted to human customs and humor, her laugh becoming a common sound in their quarters. They were building something new, a relationship that defied easy categorization, belonging fully to neither culture but incorporating the best of both. 6 months after the ceremony, Lyra announced she was pregnant. It shouldn't have been possible. Human and Valerian biology were too different. But the essence transfer had changed Kyle at a fundamental level, making him something more than human but less than fully Valerian. The doctors had no precedent for it, no data on what to expect. Kyle and Lyra faced the uncertainty together. They'd survived assassination attempts, political conspiracies, and poisoning. Compared to that, pregnancy seemed almost simple. The bond would help them, Lyra insisted. They would sense the child's needs, understand instinctively how to care for someone who embodied both their species. And she was right. As the pregnancy progressed, Kyle could feel not just Lyra, but the developing life within her. A third presence in the bond, small but growing stronger. Their daughter, they learned, though what she would be exactly, human or Valerian or something entirely new, remained to be seen. The station celebrated the news. Their child would be the first human-Valerian hybrid, a living symbol of the cooperation both species were working to build. Some still opposed it, voices on both sides calling it unnatural or dangerous. But those voices were growing quieter, drowned out by the majority who saw hope in what Kyle and Lyra represented. On the day their daughter was born, Kyle stood beside Lyra in the medical bay, holding her hand as she brought new life into the universe. The baby emerged with skin that shifted between human pink and Valerian silver depending on the light, eyes that held depths of both their heritages. She was perfect. They named her Hope, because that's what she was. Hope that the bonds between people, regardless of where they came from, could overcome any obstacle. Hope that love could bridge any divide. Hope that the future would be better than the past, because brave people chose to build it together. Kyle looked at his wife and daughter, felt them both through the bond that connected all three of them now, and knew that nearly dying to save Lyra had been the best decision he'd ever made. What she'd given him in return had truly been beyond imagination, not just enhanced abilities or extended life, but a family, a purpose, and a love that spanned the stars.